Car companies love to brag about the future, but sometimes their wild ideas belong in a comic book, not a showroom. Over the years, we've seen prototypes with nuclear reactors in the trunk, jet engines under the hood, and even ones you had to crawl into like a spaceship. These weren't bold leaps forward. They were glorious disasters on wheels. Some were hilariously impractical, others were straight up dangerous, and a few were so weird you'd think they were jokes. So buckle up and grab some popcorn. Here are the dumbest old car prototypes that never should have existed. Number 1. Ford Nucleon, 1958. The 1950s, when people genuinely thought we'd be vacationing on Mars by 1980 and fueling our cars with atomic power. Enter the Ford Nucleon, a concept so hilariously ambitious it bordered on lunacy. The idea: skip gas stations forever by sticking a mini nuclear reactor in the back of your car. Yes, seriously. Ford imagined a future where you'd simply swap out your uranium core like a battery when it ran low. Never mind that engineers never figured out how to make a reactor small, safe, and cheap enough for a sedan. Never mind the fact that a fender bender could turn into a localized apocalypse. Ford was deep in atomic age optimism, and it shows. The Nucleon never left the model stage, thank goodness. But it remains one of history's most jaw-droppingly misguided prototypes. It's less car of the future and more Chernobyl with seatbelts. Number 2. Peel P50 Prototype, 1962. The Peel P50 is already legendary as the world's smallest production car. But the early prototype was even dumber. Imagine a sardine can with wheels and you're halfway there. It had a door, singular, 3 wheels, and about as much structural integrity as a cereal box. You didn't so much drive it as wear it. Peel designed it as a city car, but calling it a car is generous. It was more like a motorized shoe. Top speed, barely 35 km/h downhill with a tailwind. Passenger space, just you. And maybe your dignity, if it fits. Reversing, forget it. There was no reverse gear. You had to physically get out and drag it backwards. The concept technically worked, but it was so impractical and ridiculous that even Peel seemed embarrassed. Yet somehow, this goofy little bubble became a cult icon. Dumb? Absolutely. Lovable? Weirdly? Yes. Number 3. General Motors Firebird, 1953. GM's Firebird is what happens when engineers watch too many sci-fi movies and forget they're designing for roads, not runways. This thing was less a car and more a fighter jet cosplay project. Sleek, pointy, and powered by a literal jet turbine engine. It looked like it belonged in the Air Force, not a suburban driveway. The concept was part of GM's dream of cars of the future, but there was one slight problem. Turbine engines are terrible for cars. They're loud, inefficient, and respond to throttle input like a stubborn teenager, with a noticeable delay. Also, the Firebird Eye's single-seat layout and laughable practicality meant it was about as useful as a wingless airplane. It was fast, sure, and it made for an awesome auto show display. But as a real vehicle, it was a glorified science experiment that had no business sharing a lane with actual cars. Fun idea. Disastrous execution. Number 4. Ford Seattle-ite XXI, 1962. By 1962, Ford had fully embraced the cars of tomorrow aesthetic. And nowhere is that more obvious or ridiculous than in the Seattle-ite XXI. This wild prototype looked like a spaceship and came with ideas that ranged from bold to bonkers. It had 4 front wheels, because traction, maybe. A modular body you could swap out like phone cases, and of course, a proposed nuclear power unit. Because why stop at one bad idea when you can have 3? Ford also claimed the Seattle-ite would use computers to map routes and handle navigation. In the early 1960s, decades before GPS existed. Spoiler, none of it worked. The concept never left the show floor because, well, reality exists. It's one of those cars that's so over the top, you can't help but admire the imagination, but also laugh at the total disconnect from logic. The Seattle-ite XXI wasn't a car. It was a cartoon dressed in chrome and optimism. Number 5. Chrysler Turbine Car, 1963. The early 60s were obsessed with turning cars into anything but cars. Chrysler's Turbine Car is the perfect example. They thought, hey, jet engines make planes fast. Why not stick one in a sedan? And so they did. The result, a vehicle that sounded like a fighter jet, idled like a lawnmower, and guzzled fuel like a thirsty rocket. In theory, the turbine engine could run on anything from kerosene to tequila. Seriously. In reality, it took forever to spool up, had atrocious throttle response, and was a nightmare to maintain. Chrysler built just 55 of them for real-world testing. And while people loved the futuristic sound, most quickly realized it was more gimmick than genius. It's an iconic piece of automotive history, sure, but as a practical road car. Let's just say there's a reason nobody else followed Chrysler's lead. The turbine car was less revolutionary and more expensive science project with seats. Number 6. Zündapp Janus, 1957. If indecision were a vehicle, it would be the Zündapp Janus. This bizarre German microcar had doors on both the front and the back. TC. And the passengers faced opposite directions, like they were riding a theme park attraction. It looked confused, drove confused, and honestly, was confused. Powered by a laughably weak two-stroke engine, the Janus could barely manage 50 mph downhill. Its unique seating arrangement meant passengers stared awkwardly into each other's souls for the entire trip. And safety? Let's just say sitting at the very front of the car's crumple zone with no engine ahead of you wasn't exactly reassuring. The concept was supposed to be clever and efficient, but it ended up being clumsy, cramped, and downright weird. The Janus wasn't so much a car as it was a punchline, a rolling reminder that not every bold idea deserves 4 wheels. Number 7. AMC Amitron, 1967. Decades before Teslas and Leafs made EVs cool, AMC took a swing at the electric future with the Amitron and swung hard into absurdity. Imagine a cartoonishly boxy, orange and black toaster with headlights, and you're halfway there. AMC proudly billed it as a city car of tomorrow, but city car of yesterday might have been more accurate. It had no real range, about 150 kilometers in theory, no real performance, and no real appeal. It was tiny, claustrophobic, and painfully slow, even by 1960s standards. And while AMC hyped its lightweight battery technology, the system was so experimental it never came close to production. The Amitron did prove that EVs were possible, but it also proved that possible doesn't mean good. It was too early, too ugly, and too impractical to be taken seriously. In the end, it was more lab experiment than car, and one that probably should have stayed in the lab. Number 8. Studebaker Sceptre, 1963. Studebaker was already circling the drain by the early 60s, and the Sceptre was their desperate Hail Mary. Unfortunately, instead of saving the company, it became a symbol of just how out of touch they were. On paper, it was supposed to be a forward-thinking luxury concept. In reality, it was a clunky mishmash of styling trends with zero identity. The design, by Italian firm Brooks Stevens, looked like someone grafted pieces of 5 different cars together and hoped for the best. The interior was filled with pointless gadgets and overcomplicated controls. And under the hood, well, nothing special at all. It was heavy, underpowered, and had no chance in a market that was already leaving Studebaker behind. The Sceptre wasn't just a bad prototype, it was a sad one. It showed a brand out of ideas, out of time, and swinging wildly at anything that might stick. Spoiler, nothing did. Number 9. Simca Fulgur, 1958. If you ever wondered what a car designed by a 1950s comic book artist would look like, the Simca Fulgur is your answer. This French fever dream promised nuclear fusion power, voice-activated controls, radar guidance, and even autonomous driving, all in 1958. Keep in mind, this was an era when most cars didn't even have seat belts. But sure, let's shoot for a self-driving nuclear hoverpod. The Fulgur never actually worked, of course. It was purely a concept, and a wildly unrealistic one at that. But it perfectly captures that mid-century optimism, or delusion, when automakers thought the future was just a few gadgets away. Its space-age looks and ridiculous tech promises make it more of a museum prop than a prototype. The Fulgur was never meant to roll off an assembly line, and thankfully, it never did. Number 10. Ferrari Modulo, 1970. Ferrari's Modulo is one of those cars that looks like it escaped from a Stanley Kubrick film set. Low, wide, and shaped like a UFO, it was a bold design statement. And that's about all it was. With no practical visibility, barely any ground clearance, and doors that required you to lift the entire canopy to get in. It was as inconvenient as it was stunning. Ferrari stuffed a V12 inside it to keep the performance label alive, but let's be honest, the Modulo was never meant to drive fast. It was a rolling design experiment, an art piece on wheels. It looked fantastic in magazines and on show floors, but would have been a nightmare on any actual road. The Modulo proved that cool and useful don't always go hand in hand, and that sometimes designers forget cars are meant to move. Number 11. Lancia Stratos Zero, 1970. The Lancia Stratos Zero looked less like a car and more like something you'd wedge under a door. Its height, just 33 inches, shorter than most toddlers. To get inside, you didn't open a door, you lifted the windshield and crawled in. Visibility was atrocious, practicality was non-existent, and driving it was a physical workout worthy of a gym membership. And yet, despite all that, it did go down as one of the most radical concept cars of the era. Unfortunately, radical doesn't mean sensible. The Stratos Zero was so low it risked disappearing under trucks, and so cramped that anyone taller than 5'8" might as well forget about driving it. It's a striking piece of design history, sure, but also one of the least functional vehicles ever built. Think Batmobile meets Coffin. Number 12. Pontiac Stinger, 1966. Pontiac's Stinger concept was the ultimate case of just because you can doesn't mean you should. It was jam-packed with bizarre, unnecessary gimmicks. A built-in vacuum cleaner, an onboard air compressor, removable roof panels, tool storage, even a shower. Yes, a shower. Because nothing says driving experience like bathing in your hatchback. The idea was to make the Stinger the most versatile vehicle ever. But instead, it became a laughable showcase of pointless extras. The car itself wasn't particularly fast or innovative. It was just there, carrying a lot of junk no one asked for. Pontiac wanted to prove they could stuff every feature imaginable into one car. Mission accomplished, but at the expense of any actual purpose. The Stinger wasn't just dumb. It was over-engineered to the point of parody. A concept car that tried to be everything and ended up being nothing. Number 13. BMW Gina Light Visionary, 2008. BMW is known for bold innovation, but with the Gina Light Visionary they took thinking outside the box and flung the box off a cliff. Instead of traditional metal body panels, Gina was covered in a flexible fabric skin stretched over a movable frame. The idea was that the car's shape could morph and change. Cool in theory, ridiculous in practice. The fabric wrinkled over time, weather destroyed it, and every bug splatter turned into a permanent tattoo. And heaven forbid someone leaned on it too hard. One accidental bump could leave your futuristic car looking like a crumpled bedsheet. BMW claimed this was the future of car design, but thankfully, nobody else agreed. Gina wasn't a car. It was an over-engineered art project. And while it looked stunning in a showroom under perfect lighting, in the real world it would have aged like a cheap pair of yoga pants. Number 14. Fiat Multipla Concept, 1956. If you thought the production Fiat Multipla was the ugliest car on earth, wait until you see the 1956 concept, because somehow it was worse. Fiat was going for innovative family transport, but landed squarely on pregnant roller skate. The proportions were weird, the stance was awkward, and it looked like the design team started sketching a van and gave up halfway through. Functionally, it wasn't much better. It was cramped, underpowered, and handled like a top-heavy shopping trolley. Fiat proudly showed it off as a vision of future family cars, a future nobody wanted. And yet, for reasons known only to them, they actually went ahead and built a production version years later, and somehow made it uglier. The Multipla concept deserves a place in the Prototype Hall of Shame for proving that bad ideas sometimes do make it to production. Number 15. Ford Probe 4, 1983. The 1980s were all about slippery car shapes, and Ford took that obsession to absurd levels with the Probe 4. It was so streamlined it looked like a bar of soap that had been in the shower too long. With a drag coefficient of just 0.15, it was a wind tunnel dream. But as a car, total nightmare. The wedge-shaped design left almost no rear visibility. The wheels were partially covered, great for airflow, terrible for turning, and the cabin was so cramped it felt like sitting inside a hairdryer. Ford boasted that this was the shape of things to come, and then wisely never built it. The Probe 4 is a perfect example of engineers chasing numbers instead of practicality. Sure, it could slice through the air, but it also sliced away any reason for a human to actually want to drive it. Number 16. Toyota X3, 1969. The Toyota X3 looked like it came straight off the set of a 1960s sci-fi movie. All bubble canopy, sharp fins, and spaceship vibes. Unfortunately, it had about as much practicality as a spaceship too. Visibility was a joke. The driver was sealed in behind a huge, curved glass dome that trapped heat like a greenhouse and fogged up faster than a bathroom mirror. The futuristic shape also meant laughable interior space and ergonomics. Getting in and out felt like climbing into a fighter jet, and once inside, you were basically blind to anything below eye level. It was a cool design exercise, sure, but one that proved why concept cars shouldn't try to look like UFOs. Toyota wanted to showcase the future of personal transportation. Instead, they built a rolling terrarium, cool to look at, miserable to imagine owning. Number 17. Idle Design Capsula, 1982. The Idle Design Capsula was built on one wild idea. Why buy multiple cars when you could just swap the body? The plan was to have a single rolling chassis, and then different capsules. A van, a pickup, a camper, that you could bolt on top like a giant Lego set. Sounds clever in theory, right? In reality, it was an absolute engineering nightmare. Swapping bodies wasn't quick or easy. Safety standards varied wildly between modules. And the whole thing cost more than just buying two separate vehicles. Plus, the capsule bodies looked painfully dull, more like shipping containers than cars. It was modular design decades before Tesla's cyber ideas, but also decades away from being remotely practical. The Capsula is a textbook case of solution in search of a problem. It answered a question no one was asking, and thankfully stayed exactly where it belonged, in a concept hall. Number 18. GM Runabout, 1964. Some concept cars aim for luxury, some chase speed. The GM Runabout? It was built for grocery shopping. Yes, this tiny three-wheeled city car came with built-in shopping baskets and a front cargo bay designed for supermarket runs. GM envisioned a future where housewives, their words, not ours, would zip around town in these mini runabouts instead of bulky sedans. The result was adorable, but completely impractical. It was too slow for highways, too fragile for city traffic, and too expensive to justify as a second car. The idea died as quickly as it was pitched, and for good reason. The Runabout is one of those rare prototypes that feels more like a toy than a vehicle. It wasn't dumb because it was dangerous or over-engineered. It was dumb because it tried to solve a problem that didn't exist. Number 19. Volkswagen Futura, 1989. If there was ever a car that screamed, "We did this because we could," it's the Volkswagen Futura. This bulbous bubble on wheels came loaded with every wild feature VW's engineers could dream up. Sliding bubble doors, rotating front seats, voice recognition, radar-assisted parking, and more. It was essentially a 1980s concept of a 2050 car, and it was way too much. The Futura looked bizarre, handled clumsily, and was so jam-packed with electronics that it would have cost a small fortune if it ever hit production. Most of its tech didn't even work reliably at the time. It was like VW threw the entire future into one vehicle without stopping to ask whether any of it made sense. The result? A rolling showcase of cool but pointless innovation. The Futura was fun to look at and impressive on paper, but also a reminder that more features don't always make a better car. Number 20. Ford Gyron, 1961. Ford's Gyron is what happens when you confuse a motorcycle with a spaceship. This two-wheeled, self-balancing prototype was designed to stay upright using gyroscopes, a technology that was barely functional even in aircraft at the time. The idea was to combine the stability of a car with the agility of a bike. The result? A vehicle that was neither. The Gyron could barely balance without its support wheels deployed, was terrifying at speed, and had no real plan for how it would handle corners, passengers, or, physics. It looked cool, like something Batman would drive, but it was doomed by over-ambition and bad science. In the end, the Gyron never moved beyond concept stage. It remains a symbol of 1960s future car mania, a bold, beautiful, and utterly useless dream on wheels.